Really, really good to see everyone here. I'm going to do a moment of visual access here. And for once, I have something new and different to say to you because I am not sitting in front of my map of the world. I'm actually out on my family's land that I share with my sisters, the 5 of us together. That was my mother's in South Central Pennsylvania. And you can see behind me, maybe, those of you who can see a screen, and I will describe it to those of you who can't, a big vase of lilacs, which was hand-picked from right in front of the door. They're all in full bloom right now. And I am wearing my, I don't even know what color you call this, but a collar kind of, what do you call this color? Rose? I don't know. Anyway, vivid, something like that. Shirt and my embroidered kippah. And I'm out in the country and so happy to be out here. It's my family's turn to open up our cabin for this season for different family members to use all summer. So here we are. And we are now recording. And we're going to start today with our Torah prayer. But I want to say before we do that, that during the Omer, there is a tradition, we've been celebrating this period between slavery and Shavuot. There is also a tradition to be studying the ethics of the ancestors, Pirkei Avot, during this period. And some of you may actually be in small groups, someplace or other doing that, or you can join things online. In some years, our own congregation has things that take place where we get to delve into Pirkei Avot together. But for today, I am just going to lift up a quote from Rabbi Meir, which is, "Whoever studies Torah for its own sake merits many things, and the creation of the entire world is for you." That is a teaching from Pirkei Avot. So as we step into this circle of learning together for our third and final session of this series, we are studiers of Torah. We are receiving Torah from each other together here. And therefore, each of us merits many things, and the creation of the world is for us. And meanwhile, I have been enlightened by Edda that my shirt is called fuchsia color. Fuchsia. Thank you, Edda. I did not know. That is really helpful. Okay, our Torah prayer, as you know, is the same as the candle lighting blessing prayer, but we're going to end it with La'asok b'divrei Torah, to soak ourselves in the words of Torah. Please join me on mute. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you to the source of all, that inspires us to delve deeply into Torah and all learning in the name of Torah. Amen. And now if you'll just take a minute to scan your Zoom room if you're able to, and I will narrate it if you're not, to see who you're learning with today. You've got 2 panels of screens, and I see so many Lev Ha'ir people, Kol Ami people, guests, friends, wonderful room. I see 30 screens. Couple of them have 2 people in them. So we're just all here together. Wonderful. Okay. So where we've come from is we're asking the question, how can a tradition that's really 4,000 years old stay relevant to current times? What are the inner mechanics of meeting the moment now, but with an ancient set of values, practices, rituals, and sacred texts? How do we do that? And especially today, we're going to look at what happens in reconstructing Judaism when a community disagrees about how to do that. What happens when there's diversity, but not only diversity, conflict and polarization? How does reconstructing Judaism do that? And so we're really going to take a deep dive into the internal workings of reconstructing Judaism. And we're going to look today at a case study of actually how this movement dealt with a very, very polarizing and difficult issue and used reconstructing Jewish mechanisms to move forward. on this issue. And many of you here actually lived through this in this movement. So you will also appreciate this case study. I'm going to start by just providing a lay of the land on this issue. And the issue is how, whether, if, and how to include gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender Jews in Jewish communities and in Jewish leadership. If you think back historically, as our own member Phil has taught us about, the Stonewall riot that launched a liberation movement for gay and lesbian people was in 1969. 10 years after that, I stepped into this story and was very much a part of it. So even 10 years after the Stonewall riot, when these issues were in the national news and they were sort of on people's radar, maybe, but in a kind of peripheral way, there had been no progress within the Jewish community around inclusiveness. And all around the country, little communities of gay and lesbian separate congregations were popping up. Here in Philadelphia, how many of you knew about Beit Ahava? So Beit Ahava was the gay and lesbian here. If you have a relationship with San Francisco, Sha'ar Zahav. In New York, it was CBST, Congregation Beit Simchat Torah. LA had one. And so the idea was that gay and lesbian Jews had to go find a separate place to be Jewish because there wasn't any inclusion or recognition within the mainstream Jewish community. And in the early 1980s, I was applying to rabbinical school. I guess it was about 1980. And I was a gender non-conforming, radical feminist, kind of reimagining choices for women. I didn't expect that I would get married to a man and then get pregnant and then have a baby and, kind of using that kind of heteronormative life process. That wasn't my expectation or desire at all. But there was 100% job discrimination and in the Jewish world. At that time, there was not a single out, in other words, open, gay or lesbian rabbi of any mainstream congregation anywhere in the world. There were plenty of gay and lesbian rabbis, but they weren't out publicly. So nobody knew in the public that they were gay or lesbian. And in the communities, most people who were gay and lesbian kept it secret, like literally didn't let their own co-congregants know anything about their lives because it was kind of shameful and not respected, very stigmatized. A lot of degradation and othering, dehumanizing around that. So I was applying to be a rabbinical student. And at that time, our reform partners at HUC, the Hebrew Union College, were giving psychological tests to screen out gay and lesbian applicants. And I had some friends who had applied there and they were screened out through the psychological test. RRC had a different way of screening out gay and lesbian applicants. They had a kind of filter question they would ask in an interview. And their filter question was, do you plan to have a family? That was the question they would ask their applicants because they didn't want gay or lesbian rabbinical students. And they didn't want to spend a lot of money and time administering psychological tests that were sort of iffy, but they asked that question to screen out gay and lesbian. So they asked me that question. And me and that admissions committee had a completely different understanding of what a yes answer meant, because I enthusiastically said, yes, I definitely plan to have a family. But I didn't mean I plan to marry a man and, do that whole thing in that sequence. So anyway, I got accepted into rabbinical school. And at that time, again, I didn't have a single out gay or lesbian teacher. I didn't know a single out gay or lesbian rabbi of any mainstream congregation. And the students who were gay or lesbian at the college were in the closet, basically. We sort of had to try to figure out who each other was, but nobody was like publicly just okay with that because you'd be expelled, basically. So into that context in the early 1980s, a truly moral and brilliant leader stepped into the picture. And many of you know this person. David Teutsch looked at the world and he said, this is wrong. And David Teutsch became the president of RRC, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and was the president for almost a decade, 9 years, around that time. And, you know, to me, moral leadership is before it's a bandwagon, really political issue. You take leadership. And David did that. He didn't do it after it was already popular and easy. He did it before it was popular and easy, when the lay of the land that I just outlined was what he faced. And he was in charge of the Rabbinical College. At that time, as some of you will remember, I know Bobby remembers this, the way the Reconstructing Judaism community was organized was there was the college, RRC, and then there was a separate organization for the congregations, which changed its name over the years. It was, I think, what was its various names? It changed its name a number of times over those years.
It was JRF, Jewish Reconstructionist Federation.
Yep.
For most of the time I knew it. It probably had another name.
It had an earlier name, but anyway,
yeah.
Right. So it was a separate organization of all the congregations. Now they are united into one body. But at that time, it was two separate organizations with completely different leadership and budgets and mission and everything. So where David had any control was in the line of the Rabbinical College. So he had a stream of influence and leadership over rabbinical student applications, rabbinical students, faculty, and administration, and the board. That was kind of his lane. And he said, how are we going to move forward in this way? And we need to move forward in a Reconstructionist way. So what is that going to look like? And he brought into this movement, building on Dr. Mordechai Kaplan's foundation, the concept of values-based decision-making, which now has initials, VBDM. VBDM is values-based decision-making, which all along had been the process of Mordechai Kaplan's idea of how decisions should be made in democratic Jewish communities, but it now had a new name, value-based decision-making. And David said, okay, let's bring the right people together to figure out what the Jewish values that underline this situation are, and then we'll come up with some recommendations and proposals. So the first step was, if we're going to have a democratic process, who needs to be part of that democratic process? And David wanted to set up a commission, and a commission is a very official thing that has representatives from different bodies. And so it was important that there be somebody from the board, because ultimately the board had the legal power. It was important that there be someone from the faculty, because if the faculty didn't like whatever came out of it, that was going to be a conversation starter. It was important that some students be there. So it was also important that there be some lay leadership, because eventually, you know, all the congregations had to somehow, sooner or later, be connected with this movement happening. Anyway, this commission started meeting and started brainstorming what kinds of Jewish values should undergird any decision we make about inclusion of a new outsider group, i.e. GLBT, whatever, Q. So I'm going to open up this conversation right now, because you guys are grounded in Torah and you're grounded in Judaism, and you know a lot about Jewish values because we live our lives by them and we hear about them every time we talk about Torah. So if you were lifting up some Jewish values for this purpose, what would you want to build a decision around? Because I will tell you, if you look in the Torah, you probably can find everything and its opposite if you look hard enough. So what are you going to choose for this process? Ruth, I see your hand and I'm going to write them down.
First of all, I'm a little confused, because where does Reconstructionism stand now? You had said there was a big meeting and then you sort of left it, for me anyway, in the air. and then ask the question. So what
Okay,
was,
Ruth, that's a really good question. And we're still in the 1980s here. You're going to hear the end of this story where I'm telling you a story step by step. So thank you for that. And we're going to get to the end of the story and you'll hear what it is now and how our movement really took leadership around this. But right now, my question is, before there was any decision, what was the group choosing as its values? And we're going to sort of enact that process of choosing the values to build a study and a decision around. And I saw some hands there, John. I saw just one from you, John. What, you need to unmute? Yes.
I would say that the phrase in the Torah that we are all made in the image of likeness of God.
Okay, so all made in the image of God. And you guys will remember that that appears in Genesis when Adam and Eve are created, that all humans are made in the image of God. Ed, and then Bobby Cohen.
Thank you, Rabbi. For a time, I was mentored by Rabbi Gabai, who was a traditional rabbi. And of course, the Sephardic traditions in Halakha are different than Ashkenazic, but he said something insightful for me just in terms of how we interpret tradition, that quarrels over halakha or law, and maybe that relates to values-based decision-making, arguments over halakha should not have too much potency, should not be overzealously argued, and should not be divisive. And I think that applies to all communities in a very powerful way.
Okay, so there's a value in the Jewish community, basically to keep the community together and not to split up, not to split and fracture into new denominations over an issue like this, I would guess. Is connected to that. Anyway, thank you for that, Bobby Cohen.
Yeah, so I see it as welcoming the stranger, which to me also includes welcoming the other.
I'm writing it down. Welcoming.
Stranger.
Yep, we certainly have that value. Probably that's the single most often repeated value. I think it's been counted in the entire Torah is about welcoming the stranger. And the other, yes. Diane.
Acknowledging one's fear of the other, bringing ourselves towards getting to understand each other.
Can you think of a place in Torah that teaches us that?
No, I'm not able to.
All right, let's keep thinking here because we're looking for rooted in Torah. But I can actually think, I'm going to direct you, Diane, to the Shema and the Ve'ahavta. So think on that for a minute. And Ed, your hand was up again, I think.
Yeah, I think of the reunions of the patriarchs, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. I'm sorry they're males, but, and their families as well. Forgive me that the Torah is so patriarchal, but I do get it from that.
So
Not your fault, Ed.
So Ed's talking about places where family members reconciled, and it's kind of a way, I think, applied to this. It's if the human family is being divided and separated in these ways, we need to bring the human family together. I see Paul.
Well, maybe I'm interpreting, but when I always remember, let all who are hungry come and eat, meaning hungry for community, hungry for knowledge, for Jewish understanding. So I think that one might also be a way of inviting or embracing from what we learn, which is, it's not quite charity, but it's a form of giving of ourselves to make sure others are at the table.
That's beautiful. And I want to go back to what Diane said, because I think, Diane, I think that value is very much in the Torah. We just need to kind of find where it is. So I'm just going to propose Ve'ahavta, you shall love. Ahavat olam, and abundant, abounding love is here for all of us. I'm just thinking about the love values that are there in the Torah. Values, that's why Beit Ahava was called Beit Ahava, the gay and lesbian congregation here in Philadelphia, because the word love is in the Torah many times. Iris Newman. You're on mute, Iris.
In 1990, when we were starting up, we had a male couple, Michael and Henry. So from the beginning, we were used to the concept. And then eventually, Julie Greenberg came along to be a rabbi, and nobody cared that she was.
This congregation was always ahead of the curve and kind of an outlier, but wait till we keep hearing the story about the whole movement. Thank you, Iris. And while we're on Iris, who lived through all this history too, is letting us know that that other name for the congregational organization was Federation of Reconstructionist Congregations of Chavarot. We called it FERCH. Thank you, Iris. Yes. So many acronyms, it's hard to remember them all, but that was the movement as opposed to the rabbinical college back then. Kathy.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was thinking of the Spira Hod about diversity, receptivity, which is coming up a lot in Counting the Omer this last couple weeks, and I don't know how it appears in the Torah, or if.
Absolutely beautiful, Kathy. And if you think about Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, that unity idea is that all of us are diverse parts of that one unity, right? We're all in God there. God is all of the diversity. Thank you for that. Beautiful. And if you guys raised a hand icon using the reaction button and you're done raising your hand, you have to click it again to unraise your hand. Or else I can't tell if you want to have your hand up. Right now, it looks like Ed and Kathy both still have their hands up. If you don't want your hands up, you need to take it down. Joanne.
Folder menu bar, audio now unmuted, leaving.
One of the values is the importance of reproduction.
One of the values is the importance of reproduction. Okay, Peru or Revu, right? Like multiply, right? Go out and multiply. That is one of the commandments in the Torah. So let's put that down. Peru, Revu, multiply yourself. Multiply. Great. John.
Space, speech on.
And also, you notice that it's like one thing that Rabbi David Green, I believe his name is, he emphasizes that God evolves, just as we evolve as individuals. God also evolves, like with the case that God all of a sudden declares herself as El Shaddai. Like, well, they were wondering, what is the difference with what makes that special? What makes why the change? All of a sudden was you didn't know how God defined herself, but now God defines self as El Shaddai. So God's evolving, so maybe we should evolve.
And actually, to build on what John is saying, the Torah has a lot of teachings about God evolving. For instance, if you look at the first time the 10 Commandments are given in the book of Exodus, they're written out in a certain way. But if you look at them again, when they reappear in Deuteronomy, an ethical idea is added in. So in the original version of them, it tells you the 10 Commandments, but then by the Deuteronomic recapitulation of those same 10 commandments. It said the reason you should do Shabbat is because your animals need to rest too. They need care and rest. And, you know, the reason there's much more of an ethical deepening. And so the idea is one teaching that's deeply embedded in the Torah is that God evolves, as John just was saying. So that is definitely a value. Any other values that we want to build this on? Meryl?
One of the things we taught in Hebrew school, when I was a Hebrew school teacher, was that discussion of God not being done with creation, that 6 days wasn't enough, and that he's creating as we go along. So as he's creating as we go along, things are evolving and changing.
Oh, Meryl, I love that creation doesn't stop with the 6th day. In fact, Bereshit means Bereshit, actually can be translated, that's the first words in the entire Torah, as in a beginning that continues.
Right.
Beginnings. So yes, so that we are partners with God in the work of creation, and it's not something that happened once and ended.
Right.
We need to keep doing that. So yes, ongoing creation. Okay. Anybody else? Let me see if there's any other hands here. I see Teresa from Pakistan here, but I don't see a hand up at the moment. Welcome, Teresa. Okay, and Karen Zeitz is saying in the chat box, value of containing opposing opinions on certain issues while being united on core beliefs. Having a container large enough to hold and even welcome difference. Okay, so where, Karen, where in the Torah are we seeing that? That's definitely a Jewish value. Where is it rooted in the Torah? Or anybody? Circling back to those unity and diversity ideas that are so prominent in the Shema and the Ve'ahavta, that whole section about and okay, so let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Can we come up with 2 more? Karen can't actually verbally participate because she's at work. Anybody else got a value here?
One more, please, Julie.
Okay, John.
Yeah, and like the Kabbalists always emphasize that the Torah should be treated with respect, but not necessarily literally. Like with maybe there's some figurative definition, like that line, "Thou shalt not lie with a man as with a woman, as it is an abomination." But what does that mean? Literal? That people take that literally, but is there a deeper meaning to that? What was what would what does the Hebrew actually say and about that, and what is the more spiritual definition of that?
Thank you, John. And I'm going to build on that idea to share a teaching that Etta loves. Etta has sort of spoken to this teaching that I've done before here many times, which is that the Torah many times gives us this value and a completely contradictory value. And the human beings have to figure out what to do. God's not giving us a blueprint. Torah's not giving us a blueprint. Here's exactly how to live your life in all circumstances. We have to put human intelligence in to figure out, okay, if the Torah says stone your rebellious child, and the Torah also says, we are people of love, what are we going to do with that? So the Torah is not only giving us one set of values. It's giving us things we have to wrestle with, think about. The Torah says, do not murder. And the Torah also says, go murder this tribe and that tribe and the other tribe and take over the land and make sure you kill the women and children too. So what do we do with what we get? That's, if you read the Bible, the Torah, and also the other sections of the Bible, it's complicated. It's complicated. So we have to put us into the picture as the kind of people trying to wrestle with it. And that's why Yisrael is sometimes considered to mean we are the people of, we're God wrestlers. We wrestle with this because it's not just handed to us. We're supposed to engage with it and figure it out. So, yeah, so like, kind of the complexity of Torah puts our human brains into the picture. We have to be engaged. And as John was saying, there are layers of meaning, not just one simple meaning. If it says stone your kid, maybe there's other layers of what that can mean. Maybe it means, wipe out the part of that child who just really can't attune to any other human being and isn't paying attention and isn't ready to be part of a human community. Make sure you address that. It doesn't necessarily mean kill your child. Those kind of things. Enid, you can unmute.
Is there a difference between welcoming the stranger and accepting the stranger?
Okay, so that's what this commission had to wrestle with, those kinds of questions. And I am quite sure they asked those exact questions. So let's take ourselves back to the 1980s, the early 1980s. They came up with a list of values. It's very similar to what we came up with. This is a good list. And they were very aware that also in the Torah, there were other things that would be difficult to contend with, such as the man should not lie with a man like a man would lie with a woman, Leviticus 25, that evangelicals were using to do anti-gay religious work. So this commission got together with representatives from all the different sectors of Reconstructing Judaism, and it got to work. And out of the early part of that work, the commission proposed an anti-discrimination clause for rabbinical student candidates. In other words, to say, unlike the experience I had had of applying to rabbinical school, there would no longer be any discrimination against people applying to rabbinical school because of their sexual orientation. So this commission made that proposal to the faculty and to the student body. The student body thought that was great. And the faculty had to really wrestle with it. The faculty had more people on it who were like, well, how is this going to go over in the bigger Jewish world? It's going to make us really marginal. No one's going to want to join this movement. We're just shooting ourselves. Here we are trying to build a new Jewish denomination. This is a terrible idea. And so the faculty was very, very divided. And the faculty had to vote. So the Reconstructionist process is that you wrestle with the values and the texts, and you're in community and you're going through this democratic process. So the faculty had to actually do that. And the faculty did it, and this took a while. And then the faculty and the student body all agreed, I guess the board probably had to agree too somewhere in there, that this would be the new policy, that the college was not going to discriminate any longer against gay and lesbian applicants. This was considered revolutionary in the Jewish world. The Reconstructionists were so worried that we're new, we're young, we're unfunded, we're already marginal. This is just going to make us, just off the map of the future of Judaism. And instead, the other movements started looking to Reconstructionists, and the students started flocking into the rabbinical college, because if you think about it, remember the days when Black athletes couldn't join Major League Baseball? And then when Jackie Robinson kind of broke through that color barrier, and all of a sudden Black talent was included in Major League sports. And what a wealth of talent and energy that released for sports. And we've sort of went through this. Well, when this happened in the Reconstructing Judaism movement, all of a sudden a wealth of talent was released into the Jewish world, because all of a sudden people could be fully themselves and be Jewish leaders and offer their gifts to the Jewish community. So that was huge. And HUC very soon also did its thing. The conservative movement took way longer. So for a long time, they were still filtering out gay and lesbian applicants, although they had plenty of gay and lesbian students. They just couldn't be public about it. I knew who their gay and lesbian students were. And during those years, we started the whole sort of underground network of gay and lesbian, Jewish, rabbinical students and rabbis and cantors. We started a group. At first, we called it Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Closet. And the Aron is where the Torah is kept. So we thought it was a cute play on words, but some of our rabbis who were closeted out in the world, but they were gay or lesbian rabbis, said, no, a closet can never be holy. We can't name it that. So we came up with a different name, which was Amenu. And for 3 years, secretly, we all raised money and supported everybody who needed to be there, whether they could afford it or not, to gather for a national secret gathering where the place, this is early 80s, the place wasn't known publicly at all. The mission wasn't public. And we would come together. And there were Orthodox rabbis there who were totally in the closet. Their own congregations didn't know, because having a rule against homosexuality doesn't stop people from being homosexual. It just stops everybody from being able to live fully as themselves and having the full diversity of humanity in your community. So there certainly were plenty of gay and lesbian leaders. They just weren't publicly out because they would have lost their jobs. And so the RRC, our Reconstructing Judaism Seminary at that point, was leading the way with opening this up to the world. But we were there with Orthodox and conservative and Reform students as well, who were having a harder time breaking through all these things, especially the Orthodox and conservative. So we all supported each other and helped that move forward. So at that point, let's look at what's happening here in terms of a movement growing through something together. The Rabbinical College was at the forefront of this. So now applicants could get in if they were qualified Judaically. Rabbinical students could graduate if they were gay or lesbian. But none of the congregations had ever faced this issue at all. And the congregations out in the movement did not want to be the first to hire a gay or lesbian rabbi. In fact, the congregations were completely opposed and they were very scared. And they started coming up with legal ways to discriminate, to make sure they didn't end up with one of these new graduates who would be publicly out. And so David Teutsch had beautifully shepherded this moral process within the Rabbinical College, but he didn't control the movement. He didn't, at that time, the way it was organized, the congregations had a completely different organization, which we now know was called FERCH, and then JRC, eventually Jewish Reconstructionist Congregations. And they had their own decision-making practice and process. So how is this going to play out? Is this going to be a split between the Rabbinical College and its own congregational community that's supposed to be hiring these rabbis who are graduating? And there was a big gap. I actually graduated out into the world right during that big gap, 1989, when the college was no longer discriminating, but the congregations were very much discriminating. And I, at that time, had had my first baby out of wedlock, it looked like, to the world, very, very intentionally on my part, but to the rest of the world, there was no husband. I was very much part of a web of, you know, Jewish feminist community life, lots of people, very not alone in doing this at all. But to the world who didn't really see alternative lifestyles and kind of family making and whatever, it was very shocking to them. And I was a gender queer human being. I mean, I remember leading High Holy Day services in those years for the Reconstructionist congregation that was housed at the college. And I was the one person out of the 300 people in that room with the one woman wearing pants. You can see how times have changed. You know, and afterwards I got a letter from the board. Why were you wearing pants, not a dress? at the service. And actually wrote back to them. I mean, I don't know where I got the chutzpah from, but just saying, why were you paying attention to what I was wearing during the High Holy Days? That's not the point of the High Holy Days. Soon enough, that changed in that congregation. I bet you go there these High Holy Days and plenty of people are dressed up wearing pantsuits or this or that. But at the time, these congregations wanted to make sure they didn't get a gay or lesbian rabbi, and they couldn't tell which of the graduates was a gay or lesbian rabbi because, you know, we just all looked like human beings, which we were. So that year, just after the anti-discrimination policy had been passed at the school, but not for the congregations, I was applying for jobs, and I was close friends with my own classmates who were also applying for jobs. And that class really was a powerhouse class. It went on to do great things. Some were gay, some were lesbian, some were heterosexual. It wasn't really about that, but it was a very powerful class. And you've kind of seen some of the people in that, my graduating class. Marcia Prager went on to found the Aleph Ordination Program. Dan Ehrenkrantz actually became president of the Rabbinical College for another 9-year period. Mark Margolius helps run the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, which has reshaped Jewish spirituality in this country, in this generation. Let's see, who else was actually, I mean, you guys probably know some of the people in that class.
Wasn't Avi in your class?
No, Avi was a little bit lower than me, Dan. I'm trying to think who else was, because this is not exhausting the list at all. But anyway, I'll probably think of some more people, but I'm just to say that these people were all out on the job market looking for jobs. And one of the, the congregations kind of were trying to figure out how to not get the one who was the gay or lesbian graduate. So they would do things like say to me things like, why don't you bring your husband for dinner before the interview? It was like a filtering question. Because they weren't allowed to ask legally during the interview, are you gay or lesbian? That wasn't allowed, but they could do these other kind of things to find out. And they knew I was this unwed mother. So they'd ask me things like, what are you planning to do for childcare? And one of my closest friends in the class was still a close friend of mine, Mark Margolius. And he had a 2-year-old, I had a 2-year-old. So we would do childcare together on Tuesdays. We'd take them to the zoo or we'd do this or that. So I told Mark, in these interviews, they're asking me things like, what are you going to do for childcare? And he looked at me, he was also applying for jobs. And he said, you know what? I have no idea what I'm going to do for childcare. Whereas I actually had a whole plan already in place. But it was my heterosexual, married, friend with a child of the same age who had no clue, because he had a wife who worked full time and he was going to have a full-time job. So he was the one who had no idea what he's going to do for childcare. So we would, sort of chuckle about these things. But in the meantime, it was actually very oppressive and I couldn't find any job. There was a firewall. They did not want a gay or lesbian graduate. So, I mean, it worked out great for me because out of the sort of necessity of, what's that saying, out of the invention is the, necessity is the mother of invention. Necessity is the mother of invention. I actually created my dream program called the Jewish Renewal Life Center and ran it for the 12 years before I came to you guys. And those were 12 great years and it was an amazing program. That's a story for another day. But it wasn't that I had to do that. I had no livelihood for my own family. I had to do something. No one would hire me. And I just, to brag a little bit, I had stellar credentials. I mean, I had founded the Hebrew school that is now the Hebrew school at Or Hadash, our sister. We started with no children. We ended up with 100 children in this thriving Hebrew school that was like winning awards. And I don't know, I had published chapters and articles, anything you could want. I had that in the interview, but that wasn't good enough because of my sexual orientation. So David Teutsch, great moral leader of his times, joined with those of us who were newly graduating rabbis or still rabbinical students to figure out what's going to happen next. How are we going to make this work movement-wide? And we strategized together. And we decided there had to be a deep learning process within the congregations, just like had happened within the rabbinical college. You can't just spring something like this onto the congregations. That's not right. They need to go through a value-based decision-making process and decide where they're going to come out. But they need to, they sort of deserve to really delve deeply and not just be told, here's the rabbinical candidates you're going to have access to. Instead, they needed to get to really study and learn and grow. So I want to ask each of you to picture yourselves. We're now kind of in the late 80s, very early 90s. Picture where you were back then in your own life journey. How, for some of you, these issues were very much on the radar. For some of you, they probably were not really, part of your daily life. And picture sort of your relationship to gay and lesbian inclusion, full inclusion or full access if you are gay or lesbian. Picture where you were in the late 80s and the early 90s. And if anybody would like to share a story, we'll then talk about what happened on the level of the congregations doing value-based decision-making. Let's have some stories. Ruth, and then I think is that Phil? Phil's hand? Okay, good. Ruth and then Phil.
I'm a straight woman and I'm married, but I remember we had a close friend that was gay, and she introduced us to quite a few gay friends of hers, and they were often anti-Semitic. I hate to say, they weren't Jewish. And I was surprised that I was very disappointed in the movement. I mean, I know it's not related to how the synagogue really accepted gay people, but I was very disappointed that so many people in her group were very anti-Semitic. So maybe you could touch on that if you have a moment later. Why that's so? I mean,
yeah, thank you so much, Ruth. So I just want to respond with one sentence and then carry on with our Phil and then Susan Thompson, which is that gay and lesbian Jews were being pushed out of Jewish community and so had to go into other spaces and often found partners and friends who were not even Jewish because gay and lesbian Jews weren't welcome in Jewish space. So opening it up actually addressed part of what you're saying, Ruth, and thank you for bringing that up. Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you. The 80s were still a difficult time for me because as a person who had always been out and who was just incapable of being anybody but who I was, it was difficult finding work. I had always wanted to be a therapist, and I had been told over and over again, you can't, because if people find out you're gay, then you'll lose clients, you'll lose your license, so on and so forth. So I took up typesetting, which was kind of a fancy form of word processing, which was something I could make a lot of money with without having to be anybody but who I was. I actually came out every time I met anybody in that profession and was pretty much accepted. And I really discovered that if you get to know people, those initial feelings about things like that, as sort of knee-jerk feelings, will smooth out over time. By the time I left the typesetting, the people were very, very accepting of me. So I looked out in the same way you did, in a way, by making my own path, because the usual path was closed. But not long after that, I was able to go back to school, get my degree in social work, and become a therapist, because by then it had turned around. And I'm sure you'll get to that point too in what you're saying today. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. And during those earlier years when he didn't have access to being a therapist, it was because there was a clause in the mental health manual saying homosexuality is a mental illness. And similar work to what we were doing in Judaism was being done within that psychological association that transformed that and ended up welcoming enormous talent in by opening the doors to gay and lesbian leaders. So a very similar process happened within that field that actually gave access to Phil. And then Susan Thompson, and then Kathy, and then Diane.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I have a sister who's gay, and during high school, She just didn't date much, etc. But nobody kind of said anything, etc. And in college, she went away to Madison. She went to a smaller school first and then to Madison. But at Madison, she really found there was a lot of freedom for gay people. And she met a partner that she stayed with for 17 years or something. And they would go to Hillel services together, etc. Which when they left college, they both were fairly religious. Not conservative, but liking religion. They just gathered more in a Havurah setting with other gay and lesbian folks. And my sister became a librarian. And she did not have a lot of discrimination openly towards her. She didn't come out openly, just unless she knew it was safe with someone, but people kind of knew, and she didn't have a lot of discrimination there. Where she had the hardest problems was with her mother and her parents coming out and, getting their acceptance, etc. But later on, past more like in the 90s, and then of course 2000, then synagogues started to pop up, small synagogues that may have been led by a gay or lesbian rabbi, or again, a more solidified Havurah, and they joined that. And they were accepted, of course, then.
Thank you, Susan. Those were very dramatic years where things were beginning to change and open up. So thank you for sharing that. And Kathy.
Yes, as an out lesbian, I found that I was actually in a spiritual community for many years, and I left mainly because I discovered it was really homophobic.
Their smiling faces as they tell jokes and laugh at.
And so I became interested in being Jewish again when I left that community, and I did find some places where there were either Havurahs or there was a synagogue, it might have been Reform, where they were going to have some activities for gay and lesbian people in the community. So they welcomed gay and lesbian there, and then I heard about a place in New York City, which wasn't that far away from me. Eventually coming into, reconstructing Judaism, I found that I was accepted and welcomed. That's my story.
Thank you. And Diane.
I would say that I might reflect exactly what was going on in the times given my age. So by the late 80s, I was already full-time professional working, still closeted. I felt it was no one's business, really, and that's just the way I dealt with it. But I found Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in New York.
Yeah.
And boy, did I come home. I had so many friends who were Jewish, who were gay, and it was just so natural for us to be in prayer together and just in community. And it was a comfort. It was a great thing to have Shabbat, Friday nights amongst all these people, and to meet people that way and have that community. But I would say that that is probably the tale of the story you're not yet at, Rabbi, because I would say that that's the cusp that you're heading to, because that was maybe the early 90s. And I just don't want to steal your thunder, but I could wait if you'd rather. But I do think that the AIDS crisis kind of helped make it okay to come to identify as gay, because people needed to step up and address this horror of a disease. And And a community like that that worked in tandem, with a larger community to address those issues. I don't think there was a better time for somebody like me to be as a young adult. But it made it easy for me because the world was changing.
Thank you so much, Diane. And let's have Paul and then Suzanne, and then I do want to finish telling this story. So I'm going to ask us to stop after those two sharings for now.
Well, first I want to thank you for your candor, Rabbi, because I haven't heard much tangible discussion about LGBT issues at all. And I know that Reconstructionism does embrace it. I actually had to reject and leave Judaism, even though I loved it when I was young, because so much was my parents and their community, what will people think? And therefore, I knew I was different. And I had to, first of all, leave the city that, where I had my upbringing and orientation, which was, it was Phoenix, Scottsdale, Arizona. And I moved to LA, the big city. I even tried a gay synagogue, but I had to even go bigger, went to New York City and even tried CBST. But I think the damage had been done. So much of it, I felt this, I didn't think I could genuinely be this thing that I sort of felt like my own religion was going to reject. In part of my work, I work with quite a few people who their religious abuse, and I wouldn't call it abuse that I got, but it was still sort of covert. I didn't trust that I could be the thing that was another identity of mine, because I had grown up really not finding any reflection of who and what I was. Never had it talked about in the synagogue, no one ever. And just like people here are saying, if you don't necessarily identify yourself, we hopefully know somebody, a relative. Anyway, so I just want to say this is helpful to me, and so it's restorative in a way, because I'm basically a lapsed Jew, and I heard somebody else say I found spirituality, and I still lead with spirituality over Judaism, but I do find an attachment to Reconstructionism because of this discussion, because they had to question and poke and prod, and it wasn't pretty. You're not saying, oh, it all turned out so lovely in the beginning. No, because people still had the feeling my parents did. It's like, well, don't shove this in my face, or don't talk about it, because then I have to feel the feelings about having a big queen rabbi, or you know what I mean? And so I'm coming around where Judaism can have a balance in terms of spirituality and in terms of being an openly gay person. So, but it's been one thing I want people to understand. It's so much work. Sometimes it's the most challenging thing for me is here I am, and I'm, past midlife, and it still can be very difficult to be gay, even though I've done the work beyond my belief to try to be who and what I am. So when I hear this discussion today, it calms me and restores me. And I need that, because it's still not thumbs up and welcome and you're okay in the world, because when you're a smaller minority and you're not, that's why I've actually, one thing I just want to end with is I find so much connection to Black Lives Matter, being Jewish and being gay, because it is a very, very difficult, you're not going to get full acceptance. You're going to hopefully have people come around, and it's not an easy way to be. So for years, sometimes I just played straight, or I didn't deal with it much, and that probably pleased my family and my community. But now, I guess I could say I'm here, I'm queer, get used to it, but that, but instead I realize I feel the inclusive acceptance overall within the Reconstruction Lafayette community. So thanks for allowing me to say that.
Thank you, Paul. Suzanne, you're going to be our last speaker for this round. I do see a bunch of other hands, but I want to catch us up to the present day before we finish this session. So Suzanne, you can unmute.
Thank you. That's so much pressure. So much pressure. Thank you very much for opening this discussion. I've been an out lesbian for a long time. I grew up in New York City, which was extremely helpful personally because who cared? Most people didn't. I knew I was hopping the train down to the village when I was 7. So it was a different thing. In the 80s, I want to say in the mid to late 80s, I was, it actually was to my benefit for work to be gay, because I was one of the first New York State certified HIV pre and post counselors. I was also a substance abuse counselor, and it was very helpful. And I had a community of lesbian and gay people. We were at the center, we went to the center all the time. We always seemed to be able to meet up together and act up and all that kind of stuff. My family, not so much. I always knew that I was a Jew. I always identified as a Jew. I was never part of a Jewish community, because this part had to be hidden.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
Always. And it didn't matter whether it was the Reform shul or it was my grandparents' conservative shul, or when I was learning with Chabad, it was the only thing that I kept secret from them. It was the only thing, I just recently discovered Reconstructionism. So I am a real newbie. I'm waiting for my books to come to start reading. So,
welcome.
So thank you. But I have to say that I'm learning. Thank you for the entree, all of you. I'm comfortable in my skin as a lesbian. I'm comfortable in my skin, as a human being and as a person involved with Black Lives Matter and involved with social justice and have a social conscience and a single mother by choice. And I never cared what anybody thought about that. But I'm feeling an extreme pull now that I'm in my 50s toward my culture, my people.
Yeah.
And I want to belong. So thank you for this,
Suzanne,
for this vehicle to do so.
Thank you for sharing all that. Really, really heartfelt. And in many ways, reconstructing Judaism was optimally situated to welcome gay and lesbian people, because we've always understood about multiple identities, that we're not just one thing. We're complicated people, right? I mean, Mordechai Kaplan taught we're American and we're Jewish. So how are we going to be part of both civilizations? And it's only expanded since then. We have multiple identities, and we want all of ourselves to show up in a community that includes all of us, because we're all made in the image of God. So this denomination was well situated, but I want to sort of now catch us up and thank all of you for sharing those stories. Very, very powerful. So here we are with the college having a non-discrimination policy, but the congregations kind of up in arms in alarm that they might get a gay or lesbian rabbi. What's going to happen? So a whole learning process started. Beautiful educational materials were created by the Reconstructing Judaism movement. The Reconstructionist Press published them, and I don't know if they still have back copies, but this one's called Homosexuality in Judaism. It's a Reconstructionist workshop series, edited by my friend, Rabbi Robert Gluck, Bob Gluck. And this is, it gives you a range of texts and questions, and it's, values-based, and it was designed to help the congregations go through the same kind of value-based decision-making. So then, after a year of taking this out into congregations and having congregations think it through and come up with, what they wanted to do, the Reconstructing Judaism movement has a convention every 2 years. And I'm starting to invite you guys to the March of 2022 next convention, which I hope to be at and to be doing a workshop at. And I know Bobby's doing a workshop. Iris has been to many, many of these conventions. And I think Evie and quite a few of you, probably Beverly, a lot of our old timers have been to these conventions over the years. They're wonderful. And there will be another one in March of 2022 in Washington, DC area, Tyson's Corner, Virginia. But back then, I guess it must have been probably the 90s by now, the convention had to vote about whether they were going to get rid of discriminating against gay and lesbian rabbis and have an affirming position about hiring rabbis and including leadership in their own communities, because there was lots of oppression and exclusion of gay and lesbian people. For instance, if a same-sex couple wanted to get married, they weren't allowed to in the synagogue. In our own Philadelphia community here, Germantown Jewish Center for years, which had a very diverse community of people, but there was a policy that you can't get married in the synagogue if you're same sex. I mean, like there was a historical moment when the first same-sex couple was allowed to get married in that synagogue, not that many years ago. So there was a lot of discrimination happening. The rabbis in many congregations wouldn't officiate at like baby namings, for a single mom who was a single mom by choice, lesbian identified, bringing a baby into the world, those kind of things. So the congregations had to wrestle with it and vote to stop discriminating and instead to become an affirming, welcoming denomination for the range of sexual orientations. And it was completely divided and polarized, 100% split down the middle, and a very, very dramatic convention, which I believe was in Baltimore that year. And the people who had been organizing around this were me and my fellow students. Then some of us became rabbis with David Teutsch's help and leadership. And actually the rabbi of Congregation Beit Simchat Torah that Diane just mentioned, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, was very much leading on this as well. Some of you may know her. And we had to decide what to do, because if we pushed this through, we probably could have won by a meager vote. But we didn't just want a meager vote. We wanted open, embracing arms from a national network, really transnational, really into Israel, of communities that understood what it meant to be a welcoming community and to be affirming and not discriminatory. So it wouldn't really do us much good if we just scraped by with, we could pass something, but with a lot of begrudged opposition. And so we caucused and we had to make a huge decision about whether we were going to ram this through or we were going to say, we can take another year, or I think it's really a 2-year period. So we can wait till the next convention, but there's got to be a real commitment to do this value-based learning and engaging around this. Like we went in and we negotiated and we said, we're not just going to ram this through at any cost, because that's not really actually going to even be a good resolution for anybody. There'll be a lot of hostility, animosity. This is the kind of thing, this is why the Protestants have like 400 different denominations. Do you know why they have 400 different denominations? Because they split at moments like this, where people couldn't work it through together. And we didn't want to do that to our precious Reconstructing Judaism movement, but we did want to make some progress on this. And so it was a really difficult thing. And we decided together, we'll wait 2 more years, but you got to do your work. Do we have that agreement? And there was actually very goodwill. We came to a real kind of meeting of the minds there that we would be willing to wait, but we'd expect a lot of progress in the next 2 years. And we'd expect our congregations to actually get to know some gay and lesbian human beings. Most of them thought they didn't know any gay or lesbian people. They didn't know their own members in their midst. And we figured if they actually knew who was in their community already, or who was the sisters or children or brothers, or bosses, like if you actually get to know some people, it looks totally different because you already know them. They're not some scary, dangerous other thing. The other thing that had to happen, which is something Joanne touched on, was historically, the world assumed that gay or lesbian people wouldn't have children. And in fact, access wasn't given to gay or lesbian people to make children, really. you weren't allowed to adopt babies as a single person or a coupled same-sex person. That was against the rules. And, there wasn't access to the whatever you needed, the egg or the sperm to make the baby in other settings. So if we're going to be an affirming, welcoming Jewish community, it means we're going to start seeing a lot of kids of gay and lesbian people. And in fact, that's what happened. That once, 2 years later, the vote did go through,
Found that taking bilberry powder
Reconstructing Judaism did become an affirming network with a huge amount of education and values-based growth. And what ended up happening was just a explosion of children especially in the big gay and lesbian community. So if you go to Congregation Beit Simchat Torah now, or if you go to Sha'ar Zahav and any of these big ones in the big cities, there is an enormous population of children. And some of them come into the community through adoption, some of them come in through donor insemination, alternative conception, all sorts of different ways of getting babies, surrogacy. But what it meant was suddenly life came into these communities because it was a whole transformative welcoming process. Like 6 million Jews died. We want to reproduce the Jewish community. And suddenly this opened up new possibilities for sort of expanding our next generations. And that was another piece of this that was very dramatic. So the reason we're talking about this today is because we're looking at a very complex, challenging issue for the Jewish community, a case study of how we internally moved from traditional places to innovative places while keeping our community together. And how we did it was through democratic, values-based decision-making, which is what we use. Since then, that's a case study that started kind of in the 1980s. We've had other big issues that we've worked through, and I'm just going to name a couple of them because many of them haven't touched our community deeply, but some of them have. One of those issues is around interfaith marriage. Traditionally in Judaism, Jewish people are supposed to marry other Jewish people, and there's a very specific definition. And as the world opened up to love more, and we no longer lived in a ghetto, people fall in love with people of all different backgrounds. And how is that going to be wrapped into Jewish community? Again, the Reconstructing Jews led the way and ended up with, a welcoming practice for interfaith relationships. Even more recently, another really difficult issue in the rabbinical college has been, are rabbis allowed to have non-Jewish partners? And in particular, can applicants to the rabbinical college have non-Jewish partners? Can rabbinical students have non-Jewish partners? And can you graduate with a non-Jewish partner? There was a really difficult split because the congregations were saying, all of our people are interfaith people. We want a rabbi who can also be in an interfaith relationship and will do things like marry interfaith people. We're going to take a few extra minutes, not a huge number, but I just want to wrap up this piece. And so the congregations in this case were leading the way and the rabbinical college was behind. So it was the opposite dynamic than with the gay and lesbian issue. In this case, the congregations were saying, we don't want a rabbi who, doesn't respect and completely value interfaith partnerships, including maybe that's what format they're in, but certainly who would recognize other people in an interfaith relationship. We don't want that traditional version. And the college hadn't caught up. The college was, and so that took 5 years to wrestle through. And very recently, like a year or two ago, the college came up with a principle that it is okay to have a non-Jewish partner. It's literally it has initials, non-Jewish partner, NJP, I guess that issue was called, as people discussed and debated it for 5 years. And now applicants and students and graduates can have non-Jewish partners. And it has opened up the amount of talent pouring into the college. I teach at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and I see who the applicants are and who my students are. And this policy, which right now is the only denomination that has this policy, so any student who wants to be a rabbi who has a non-Jewish partner comes to RRC. So it's an enormous pool of talent now coming in to RRC that was actually banned, that wasn't tapped before. So again, it's the same kind of thing, like, you know, so these things are complicated. And you know, there's the pacing and there's the how exactly, and there's the whether it's right and all of that. But at some point, I guess I take a stand with a huge amount of respect for people who lead on the moral issues before it's popular. Right now, in our Jewish wider Reconstructing Judaism network, there is a big issue that's divisive, contentious, disruptive, upsetting. I'm going to name it. We're not going to delve deeply right now. Our community polarizes around two interests that don't actually need to be at loggerheads, but socio-politically they are. And one says every Jewish person needs to be safe, and the other says Palestinians need to be free. And in fact, both of those values are essential. Every Jewish person needs to be safe, and Palestinians need to be free. They don't have to clash. But as it is in our organized Jewish community, those interests are held by different groups. Very, very complex. We're in it. And it's kind of interesting because I work in an interfaith setting at Power, and many of the Black clergy are where we were 30 years ago with gay and lesbian issues. They're in it. The Methodists divided last year. They practically had a denominational breakaway because they refused some aspect of this. I think it was to recognize gay or lesbian leaders. I actually haven't followed it that carefully, but they're in it in a desperate, upset way around this exact thing. We got over that decades ago, thank God. Now we're in it on the Israel-Palestine issue. And I hold us with great tenderness and gentleness around that, because Jewish communities have not yet figured out really how to talk about that. So a lot there. I mean, I feel like we could go on forever, but actually I want to appreciate people's participation and appreciation. I want to appreciate Diane and her committee really for shaping these three sessions of this series. And all of you steadfast, long-term Reconstructing Jewish activists. It's so fun to share this with my old timers in this community who lived through a lot of this. So thank you for all that. And we are going to actually end with two things today. We're going to end with our song for learning Torah together. We're also going to end with the counting of the Omer, and I'm going to say something about some recent news related to that. So let's just land here and take a breath. For our teachers and our students and the students of our students, we ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. And now, in a minute, we're going to count the Omer, since we are together today, even though it's daytime and it's usually done at night. But I do want to say that Friday was Lag BaOmer, which is a day, the 33rd day in the count, when there's usually a break and people have picnics and celebrate outside, and it's just a break. It's actually honoring the break in a plague in ancient times. There was a plague that afflicted Rabbi Akiva and his students. And there was one day when the plague lifted and everybody celebrated. I think we can all relate to that this year, celebrating the lapsing of a plague. But a tragedy happened in Israel, as you probably heard in the news, during that Lag BaOmer celebration. And so just want to, as we count the Omer today, acknowledge that some people as part of the celebration were actually trampled in a stampede and lost their lives. And so
one of Zenith Lab.
Just condolences and blessings for recovery and healing for their family members. Very sad. As we count the Omer today, it's the same as the Candelani prayer, but it ends Al Sfirat HaOmer, about the counting of the Omer. If you'd like to rise in body or in spirit, you're welcome to. I'm going to stay facing the camera so we can actually do it together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat ha'omer. Thank you for the inspiration to lift us in spiritual ascent day by day from the slavery of Mitzrayim to the peak of Mount Sinai. And let us say, Amen.
Thank you, Julie.
Amen.
Today is
Thank
the
you.
30
Thank
today
you,
is
Rabbi.
the 36th
Thank
day
you,
of
Rabbi
the
Julie.
Omer. Love to all.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Love
thank-
everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Great to see you
Thank you.
all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, well.
See you soon.
Love to hear what she said, Liz. I'm unmuted.
It was a great idea.